Okay, welcome. This is about the Great Resignation. We're going to wait till people fully arrive. We're not going to resign and leave. We're going to actually stay in place and wait for you to join in. So just for a few seconds, and we have a wonderful panel, and I'll introduce you to them. And they're broad ranging, so I think we'll get a lot from this session. Okay, let's begin. Our topic is the Great Resignation in Canada. What is it, and what are the consequences for employers and employees? So a double-sided talk. My name is Harvey Schachter. I'm not used to being seen. I'm a freelance writer, and I do 2 columns a week on management in the workplace for the Globe and Mail. With me, Nabila Extablan, who's Executive Vice President of People and Corporate Affairs at Walmart Canada, Navio Kwok, the Vice President of Research and Marketing at Kilberry Leadership Advisory, and Ian Cook, Vice President of People Analytics with Vizier, and that's in Vancouver. So before I turn it over to them, I thought I'd just spotlight the issue a bit. It strikes me as a journalist, there's a great power in a great phrase or a great headline. So the Great Resignation, which Ian predicted in April, is now upon us, and it's everybody's catchphrase. It's in groups. My own leadership group meeting the other day, it kept coming up all time after time. But we want to, I think, explore just how powerful this is in Canada and where it is. There's some signs that it's far more common in the States than in Canada. So hopefully our panel will help us to come to grips with that. I think a second aspect of that is this just a catch up from from what happened with the pandemic? And, in a year, will we not be talking about the same issues, or will they still be prominent? And then I think more importantly, the 2 issues that were raised by the title of the session. What's the impact on people? What are the opportunities that it opens for them when we start to see more movement in jobs? Perhaps some advice on what to do with that situation for yourself. And then finally, the impact on organizations and how are they coping? It's very, very expensive to replace somebody. It can be confusing. It can break up teams. It can give you a sense of going down the drain. I still remember 50 years ago, a key staff member resigning on the weekend of Labor Day, starting a new job on Tuesday, and boy, it wasn't a good weekend for me. So, and I still remember it. So there is a lot of power in it. So why don't we get to the actual discussion? Ian will start us off. As I said, he is a analyst, people analytics, and saw this coming in last April. He has worked for the last 15 years building analytic products which improve an organization's people strategy, and they're used by over 8,000 organizations, including organizations like Lego and Unilever and Deutsche Bank and TELUS. So a lot of perspective. Ian?
Make sure I get myself on mute and not perform that classic Zoom move. Thanks for the introduction, Harvey, and it's a pleasure to be here, folks. So let me start with, what is this thing? I think that's the piece that we can answer well and build the conversation about, and then how do we respond to it? So what Vizier sits on is lots and lots and lots of data from employers. We look at the data from the core transactional system. So who is an employee, who isn't an employee, that's in our data set. And so this is what we looked at back in February. I lived through the Great Recession, and I did a bunch of studying of what happened in the dot-com bust. So 2 very significant disruptive events in the economic cycle. In both of those, the general perception of the world is like the labor market stops. It's like there's no business, there's no money, everybody's just hunkered down, holding on to their job, doing nothing. That perception is wrong. We know that from the previous two recessions we've lived through. There's actually a fairly high amount of labor churn even during a recession. So we sit on the ability to aggregate, to summarize all of our customer data, and that's in the millions of records. So we went to look at the resignation patterns. We have this somewhat beautiful system where everything's normalized. So we know who's a woman, we know different tenure bands, we know different age bands, and we have that again across millions of records. So we looked at the resignation rates, and we have a means of forecasting those forwards. And we've got about 7 years of history. So whilst you'll see Gallup and you'll see a bunch of surveys saying 80-90% of people are thinking about leaving, what we measure is actual leaves. So who has physically not an employee in your business anymore. And what we saw back at that point in time was an uptick and a forecast on that uptick, because we're looking at it every month, that said, this is looking like it's trending high. We have a partnership with a group called MZ Burning Glass. They look up labor market stats. So they're tracking job postings. They're tracking how much demand is out in the market. And they were also seeing a spike. And so we put two and two together, understanding that labor participation is less. There's fewer people out there working. You start to get this storm that has created an Great Resignation, Great Reset. There is two perspectives on this. There's the employer side, which I think is the Great Resignation. There's the employee side, which is more of a Great Reset. And so again, we produced something it was published in April, that led to the Harvard Business Review article that we've referenced, which is leading to this recognition now that there's a lot of labor churn, and it's not just catch up. And I've got two more points to make, and then I'll hand on to the next speaker. But when we looked at our data, we've got it broken down by age group and working tenure. So how many years have you worked in a business? If it was catch up, typically that's the early stage professionals who are trying to accelerate their career. And so there's it's under 30s, and there's usually 0 to 3 years of tenure. There's an acceleration there. So a portion of the Great Resignation was that population. What surprised us when we went to look was that the 35 pluses, the 45 pluses, the 5 to 10 years, 10 year plus tenure ranges. So people who've been in your business, and it goes to what you were saying, Harvey, people with experience, people who are that solid core, who know your customers, know your product, know your service, know how stuff works, know who to talk to when stuff breaks. They're also the population that are reflecting on what do I want to do for work. And the increase in exits from that population was a lot higher than we had anticipated. And that's where, there isn't one thing that drives the Great Resignation. There's at least three in terms of the different pockets of employees that we see. But from our measured data, and then this is just to give it scale, across North America, we're seeing a 25% annual rate, which compares to a 22% annual rate for 2019. 2019 was already elevated. We were already in a low unemployment. When employment hits to the sort of between the 6 to 4% range, resignations increase because there's just higher availability. There's a known inverse relationship there. So we were in that state in 2019. So that was high. 2021 is higher by a substantive margin than 2019. So again, this, is the Great Resignation real? Is it happening? You can get lost in the anecdote and I know somebody who's staying. I was like, my business isn't affected. You'll have heard all of that. What we want to do is say all of that is true, and you're looking at the elephant from different corners. We kind of have the capacity to measure the elephant and use that to understand what is actually happening on a macro scale. And so it's true. It's got different components. It is a higher rate in the US, but there's definitely a signaling that it's happening in Canada as well. And employers need to respond. I mean, we can get to the point, is this forever, or is this a wave? I definitely have opinions on that. I'll jump in on that when we get to those questions. But I think, from our perspective, with the data we have, this is a real phenomenon. It's been running since May. People need to understand it so they can respond effectively.
So if I just two quick questions, and maybe not wait too much for later, but one is, what are the three drivers? Very briefly, what are they?
There is a bunch of young people who are looking to grow their career fast. see opportunity to move, get better salary, get better positions, build their capacity to build the life they want, buy a house. I mean, we all know how high costly property is in any of the major metro areas. There's a young, smart, hungry population that are looking to accelerate their careers. Their chance to do that is kind of unparalleled right now. Then there is the mid-career group, and some of those are in a life stage where they have children and maybe they're both working, and so they're just adjusting. How do I engage with work? Do I want to go more part-time? Does one of us want to work full-time and go live in a lower cost location so we can actually balance work and family? And then there's a portion who are just looking to maximize their flexibility. They may or may not have kids. They may or may not be in a relationship, but actually they've learned to access gig work. And the friction on gig work has always been access to work. The technology has taken all of that friction away. If you are good, you can build a portfolio. There's platforms that allow you to do it. And so I can go and work and live in a remote place, and I can work as a quality analyst for a technology firm, picking up gigs when I want to work. And so that there's three very different components. I mean, those are our primary thing. Again, recognizing the space that Nabila works in. There's also people who are trying to just maximize revenue, like make sure that they're getting paid the best they can in a hot job market, and that's also driving it in that hourly wage area. So, it's different for different industries, but from the data we looked at, those are three clear categories that we think exist.
And we've all been watching curves and hoping we'd flatten curves. So I don't know whether we hope this curve flattens or continues. It may depend on our perspective, but what can you say from the previous kind of recession and others that you've studied? What do you predict about the curve, and what have you seen so far? Is it accelerating, escalating, or declining?
So from what I would say in Canada is that the rate is accelerating. There's this a known state called turnover contagion. When somebody leaves your work group, you kind of go, oh, maybe the grass is greener. Why am I here? What have they seen that I'm not seeing that means somewhere else is better for them? So it just causes people to question what they want to do. So it's a researched effect. So as resignations kick in, so too people's looseness to resign kicks in. As the market heats up and it becomes hard to hire, so too opportunity comes across their desks. So there's been an acceleration. Our go forward forecast is this isn't a blip. This is not a kind of quick shuffle around post pandemic and we'll all settle down to this nice, stable, steady state that we had pre-pandemic. Our forecast is that labor volatility is here to stay. It's not going to keep accelerating up, but it's going to stay at an elevated rate. Labor market participation is one. There's just less people working. There's a lot of stats. The boomer generation, a lot of them kept working out of habit. The data I've seen, that's reversed. And so a lot of the retirement rates have kind of massively increased and sort of resorted back to their norm. So that takes hundreds, if not millions of people out of the labor pool. There's other people just not coming back to work because they've adjusted their lifestyle. So when you have supply constraint, you have a more volatile labor market. We see economic headwinds that could slow that down. Everybody's worried about inflation right now. We're not sure where interest rates are going. We've got supply blocks. What that might slow down the economic growth. That will slow it down. But if we run through those, then we are in a volatile labor market. A heightened labor market for the foreseeable future. So our perspective is get ready.
Get ready. Okay, so Nabila, you see it on the ground. You've got 100,000 employees, one of the largest employers in Canada. You've also got international experience I should refer to. You were head of digital transformation at Inca, which is IKEA's digital operation and retail transformation. You were involved in there as well. And you've also worked at Starbucks. So you've got some real experience with practical organizations Tell us what you're seeing and what you expect.
Yeah, I think the statistics that were just shared, I think, are all a really great indications of what we're seeing. It's interesting. I mean, when I reflected on this, who would have thought, right, 2 years ago when we entered the pandemic, that we would be having this conversation, right? That we would be basically facing one of the tightest labor markets that we've probably seen since the Great Recession, and that we're facing this type of reshuffle. I think the statistics in Canada can be confusing, I think, as was early stated, but the trend is definitely there. The US is, of course, experiencing this at a different scale than we are in Canada. So more than 19 million US workers have quit their jobs since April. And there was a recent article in the Globe and Mail and a statement by the senior economist at Indeed Canada that said, we're not seeing the same scale in Canada yet. But, as was just mentioned, I think all indications are pointing to that direction. So it's definitely something that we need to be aware of. When I think about this topic, I like to think about it as the Great Reassessment, because at the end of the day, that's what the pandemic has accelerated people's thoughts around, is how, what is my relationship with my employer? What are the conditions that have to be true in order for me to stay at my current employer? What are the things that would attract me or get me to consider, job switching? And, what would that mean for me? And so I think everyone at all levels of every organization is having that conversation with themselves and with their partners and their families and reassessing. And that's what happens when we go through a traumatic, global experience like a pandemic, is that reassessment. And I'm glad we're reassessing, because I'm a huge advocate for, redefining our relationship with our work. I think that especially in the West, we have had a somewhat unhealthy relationship with our work. And we've known for some times that Gen Zs and Gen Ys are going to challenge that. And so it's no surprise that here we are. We've gone through a global traumatic experience, and, we have an aging population. We know that Gen Zs and Gen Zs and Ys are going to be the majority of the workforce. We know that they value experience over most other things. And here we are. I think it's just like the perfect storm for all of those indications that we've been looking at from a macro perspective, hitting us at the same time. And so it's accelerating organizations' thought about redefining what work is. I mean, we're rewriting the rules of work. Organizations are rewriting the rules of work, and employees are redefining what they want the relationship with their employer and their workplace to be. And I think there is a lot of, great reassessment, on the workplace, and a great reassessment on the employee base. And I think it's still too early to tell how that's going to shake out. I think we're going to be in this reevaluation and reassessment of the relationship between an employer and the employee for some time. It's going to take us some time to redefine that and figure out, what that relationship will look like. What we do know, though, is that purpose drives more, purpose is by far one of the biggest drivers, of that relationship. So people want to know that what they're contributing towards has some meaning, that is really important. And then the relationship with their leader and their manager is also really important. They want to feel valued and appreciated. And that's not going to change. I think that's just going to continue to accelerate. We know that trust in systems is low. And so they want that type of really meaningful relationship with their employer. And then the third thing I'm saying is flexibility is paramount. Flexibility. And I definitely would agree with Ian that there is a portion of the population that sees this just as an opportunity. This is an employee market. So if I can switch and, get greater income or greater benefits, then I'll do that. But I think people will, having just gone through this experience, I think people will pause if that doesn't come with flexibility and that doesn't come with a type of purpose and culture that they feel they can connect to. I think of this as the Great Reassessment. I welcome it in the conversation because I think it's challenging all of us to redefine what does success look like in the workplace, rewrite the rules of work, and redefine the relationship between the employee and the employer. And I'm a huge advocate that I don't want to go back to normal. I want us to build a better normal. I want us to build a relationship in the workplace that allows people to feel professional achievement and accomplishment, be able to, find meaningful employment, and still be able to do all the other things in our lives that we want to be part of our lives. And I don't think we've had that balance in the past. So that's kind of my introduction to this conversation.
And what do you think is going to be the hardest thing for organizations?
I think the hardest thing for organizations is not reverting back to old muscle memory. Now, as we're moving into a hybrid workplace, and we're seeing it, right? We see 30% of employers want their associates and their people back in the offices 100% of the time. We start to see disconnects between, what employers want, and it is easy to go back to that muscle memory. We knew how to work 100% of the time in the office, or we knew how to work 100% of the time in a certain way. And then overnight we went into, a pandemic and a completely different way of working. And it's very easy for leaders and managers and organizations to kind of pull back to what they know. And I think that's probably the biggest risk is challenging that muscle memory and making sure that we don't allow ourselves to do that. I also don't think that the employer base of the future will allow us to do that, but some organizations are going to struggle with that more than others.
And what about for the individual? What for them is the biggest risk or biggest danger as they kind of assess the grass is greener on the other side or whatever their future?
Yeah, I think the biggest risk for the individual is that this is going to continue to change really, really fast. So my advice for associates is always to really clarify what impact do you want to make, what do you want to learn, and who do you want to work with or for? And how do you take individual responsibility for what you want to learn? Every industry has increased their transformation agenda by 3 or 4 times. Every industry, every sector has accelerated in their transformation, in digitalization, in automation, in the way that we're working. And so skills also, they're also looking for hot skills to be able to manage businesses that look very differently than they did, 2 years ago. And so I think as the individual, have you taken the time in this great reassessment to figure out what do you need to learn so that you can be relevant and competitive in the future? And how do you continue to be really curious about what and how industries are evolving so that you can be the type of associate and employee that the next, generation of companies will need. So there's definitely a responsibility there on each individual to do that.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sure we'll have other things we want to add later. That individual aspect, Navio was telling me 2 career moments for him that were kind of critical. One was he was an academic, and he realized that he needed to, he didn't want to be branded just as an academic. And so he took an internship to try and break into the corporate world. There was the usual thing. We kind of don't want to pay you. You don't know anything, but eventually they learned he knew things and they did pay him. So that was one. And then also he kind of, in a sense, was an early part of the great reassessment. But he took his current job during the pandemic, which was a bit of a scary moment for him. So Navio, maybe you can talk about what you've seen about this great reassessment, great resignation.
Yeah, thank you, Harvey, for that introduction. One thing I think about with this great resignation is that originally it was thought of during a pandemic, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? We really weren't sure how to address this novel virus. And so when there's uncertainty, we tend to want to find things with a sense of stability. So we're going to stay put. However, when the uncertainty sort of alleviates, we have a better grasp of what's going on, then that's when we're going to see movement. So a speculation I have on my part is the economic recovery in the US has definitely been a little bit quicker than Canada. Their vaccine rollouts were also a little bit quicker. And so this might point to a reason as to why in the US we see a little bit more movement, that there is a little bit potentially less uncertainty with the folks down south compared to Canada. And I think uncertainty also plays out in a different way. So in Ian's very comprehensive data set, there's a lot of movement with these mid-career folks that is driving this great resignation. And I think in part, these are the individuals from the perspective of an employer are less risky or uncertain hires. They have more experience. They know what a good working relationship is like. They probably know what they want in their lives as well. And so you add all that together, they're a very, very good hire. On the flip side, I think his data showed that the younger employees weren't the ones who were necessarily driving this as much. And so that uncertainty part plays out in different ways. And part of the power of uncertainty is that it can cause anxiety. And when we're anxious, we want to control our environment, sometimes in ways that may not be possible. We might be doing things that we think control things, but it actually doesn't, get the outcome that we want. But one of the, I think, bigger concerns around this time is high potentials in an organization. These are people who are always aware of the market. They're always kind of looking, this job search activity. They may already be flagged internally in an organization as someone who's a star employee. So they have options. They know they have options. They know what they are. And so these folks are going to be the ones that maybe during this time feel a little bit uncertain. There's less opportunities for networking. Having those coffee chats that you could have done now seem a little stilted because it's a quick Zoom 15-minute, 30-minute thing. It's not as organic, right? And so if you don't have these opportunities for them to at least get a sense of their progression in their career, probably in ways that they had expected prior to the pandemic, they're going to feel uncertain and anxious. They're going to start to take control over these feelings. And maybe this is going to drive some of that movement. And the interesting thing too is these people probably had really good advocates or mentors in their organization. Now these people, part of that mid-career group, start to find different jobs outside of the organization. Then now their advocate inside the organization is gone. So they're going to go, what does this mean for me? And they're going to feel this sense of uneasiness. So for an employer, what you really have to do is to keep these people, in an arm's length, start to open up those conversations with them, give them a little bit of that control back, let them know that, here's where you're thinking the organization is headed. There's obviously going to be a lot of strategic changes. Nabila mentioned the transformations are just so rampant right now. And so when you have these types of moves, you're going to have restructures, you're going to have some natural churn. Let them know that this is happening preemptively. Let them know what that might mean for them and have that open line of communication. But also recognize that, people aren't always leaving for money-related reasons. For sure that's a factor. But, something we're not sure of the future is there going to be some sort of regression to the mean? It's not going to keep skyrocketing. And at some point, the levels, whatever they are, will kind of plateau. And so when all employers are going to offer flexibility and autonomy, or at least we can be optimistic that they do that, then you kind of hold a lot of things constant between organizations. So what becomes your differentiator as an employer? Well, it's going to be those things that Nabila talked about, the purpose, right? Are you going to be part of an interesting organization that solves really meaningful problems and something that the employee can get behind? You have these things, they are going to stay. It's not always about money, but it is a very scary thought for an employer when they're these high potentials specifically, they're just getting thrown so much monetary incentive to leave.
And if I could just maybe comment on
Absolutely
what Navi just said. So an alarming statistic that we pay a lot of attention to is 50 to 75% of Gen Zs have left a job because of stress or anxiety related well-being, as an example. I mean, if we want to talk about why people are leaving or reconsidering, again, going back to setting our relationship with work, being able to have that workplace where you can truly feel a sense of inclusion and belonging and continue to maintain your health and well-being is going to be, in my opinion, two of the most important factors that drive purpose. So we talk about it as three movements. There's a movement around, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's a movement around well-being and realigning our relationship with our workplace so that your work is contributing to your health and well-being. And then the third one is around regeneration, so that the work that we're doing is contributing positively to the environment, and we're all working towards, a positive impact in offsetting what's happening from a climate change perspective. Every industry and every person needs to be pulling together on those three movements. And I think, again, to Navio's point, money can and the competitive in the wages that are happening is an attractive proposition. But if people don't feel a connection to those three things, I think that's going to be short-lived.
Anybody else with any thoughts on what was just said?
Yeah, I was going to build on both what Nabila and Navio are saying around this habit. Like, it was in the press a while back, but the number of organizations where also goes to uncertainty. What we believe leaders need to understand is that their pandemic was not the same as their employees' pandemic. One thing that distinguishes somebody in a management leadership position is control over work. And so what you feel about this as a leader is not the same as your employees. And so lots of that group are going to like, right, we'll just go back to the office. I read a very interesting McKinsey piece yesterday where the manager's assumption was that we were going back to the work habits that we had, and they were asking why, and it's like, well, it's just right, isn't it? And they had no basis for why it was right. They just had habit. And so I love the three themes of that Walmart's putting out there and Nabila's putting out there, because if you're as a leader going like, thank goodness this is over, we can just go back to how it was, that's going to be the trigger point for all of those highly stressed employees who've kept you safe, commercially for the last however long, to suddenly say, right, everyone, back to the office, back to your gray cubicle, back to rubbish coffee, let's just do this. Like, it's such a violation of what people have done for you. But it may come from habit, not from thought. And I think that's the really important piece about this as a reset is, you have to intentionally build your world of work going forward. There is no going back.
Navio, did you want to add? I thought I saw a signal of that.
Yeah, no, what Ian mentioned, and actually Nabila as well, these expectations are changing. A term in the academic literature, we call that a psychological contract. You have these sort of mutual obligations that both an employer and employee have around this working relationship. These aren't things that are written in your physical contract, but there's an expectation. I want to be able to get development opportunities. I want to be treated with respect. I know there's, labor laws with that, but there are these things that are sort of unwritten. And these expectations are now changing. And when an employee feels that there is a breach of this contract, there's usually a sense of violation, as Ian mentioned, a sense of mistrust. And these things lead to the behaviors that we see. People are less satisfied in their work. They perform less well. And then they have these intentions to leave. And I know intentions aren't everything, but in the research, general sort of understanding is that intentions to leave do predict actual turnover. So sort of the movement in your turnover, around 25% of that variability is predicted by your intentions to leave. And this is higher than your satisfaction with your job, satisfaction with your work, or commitment to your company. So it's a powerful indicator. And if there are options, then you're going to start to look. And so perhaps a recommendation for employers too, if they want to hop on this, is accept that these new norms are here to stay. And the more that you do not accept that, what's going to happen is then people will leave. So if you're an employer who's willing to hop on to these new, and arguably, I definitely 100% agree, are better ways of conducting and doing work and having a relationship with your employee and with the employer, then people will leave for those organizations. And now you've cast the net to attain, and if you stick with it, retain those employees.
So we're talking organizations and the binding to organizations, but you know, in the past, the major reason people left was their boss, their direct boss. Has that changed? And if it hasn't, what do I do if I'm running an organization about this immediate supervisor issue?
You know, the team, the closest kind of nucleus of the team that an individual is part of has the biggest contributing factor to their relationship with their employer and their experience at work. And we know through all of the work around teaming and the great research that's come out of Google that psychological safety actually happens most significantly in that nucleus of that kind of first line of that team. So that still is true. I think that's going to be true for a long time. So the relationship that manager has with the employee and the relationship and kind of the health of that team and the psychological safety that manager creates for that team and for the employees is paramount. And then I would also then say that, you know, that has to be echoed at the top, because you can have a great manager who happens to have the ability to do that really well in one unit or one industry or one part of the organization. But if it's not echoed at the top and it's not a systemic kind of tone at the top and it's not what the company believes in, then you might just happen to have the best boss in that organization, right? So it needs to be both driven by the individual leader as well as something that is a culturally, you know, a cultural aspect of the organization, and there has to be a clear tone at the top. Now I want to get really practical. So we have a lot of amazing leaders listening to this and thinking, okay, what do I do? How do I increase my individual competence to be that type of leader? One of the things that we've done recently at Walmart Canada is we've committed to training all of our leaders to be mental health first aid certified. Right? We know that anxiety is high. We know that people are struggling in ways that we've never struggled before. And, you know, we know that people are uncomfortable, or our leaders are uncomfortable knowing what to do or how to support their associates. And the days of just saying, well, you can call EAP are gone, right? Again, back to that psychological contract. I want my manager to care about me. And if I have a problem, I want them to ask if I'm okay. And then I want them to be able to help me figure out what to do. And that's something that we're really focusing on education and capability to equip our leaders to know how to better support their associates. Focusing on anxiety in the workplace. What are the drivers of anxiety? How do our leaders help our associates with overload? How do we help our associates with increasing those social bonds? You know, so really doing deep dives in anxiety in the workplace and the drivers of it. You know, focusing on vulnerability and wise compassion in a way that increases psychological safety. And we're doing this all the way down to you know, across the entire organization, across all of the levels of the organization. It takes time. I've had lots of conversation with leaders that said, you know, this is amazing. I'm so glad we're focused on this, but I've never done this before. And then you layer that on top of, you know, trying to address challenges around diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial inequity, and all of the things that are happening. And then you layer that on top of, you know, what's involved in just running the business and the operation and keeping people safe. And you layer that on top of what they're going through. I also have a lot of compassion for our leaders because, yes, Ian's absolutely right. The experience has been different between leaders and their employees, but our leaders have also gone through really challenging situations, and it's also hard for them. So I think that's the other thing, that the expectation of that social contract has changed and it's increasing. And the expectation of what it takes to actually lead in this new world is also increasing. And organizations, you know, really need to support their leaders to be equipped to manage all of it.
Yeah, I fully agree with Nabila. I think often that you know, people leave managers is an oversimplification of the dynamic. Like, a manager can only operate with the skill they have, the resources they have, and the framework they operate in. And, you know, kudos to Walmart for like understanding that system and putting that piece in place. The other thing we've recommend in terms of chunking this out is not to try and solve it for everybody everywhere at once. We've seen really strong results from some of our clients where they're using the data to go to a specific division, population area, and they're coming up with a very specific change. I'll share a quick story from one of our manufacturing clients. They recognized that in a certain population that women were leaving at a much higher rate. They went to ask, and again, you know, building on what Nabila and Navy are both saying, listening to the employee was key. They identified that the shift pattern didn't work for women. So women were not able to balance their worlds and come to work in the way that they could in the past. So they went to the operations crew and said, look, we're going to be short-staffed on the machines if we can't find a way to fulfill this shift. Why is the shift pattern the way it is? And they're like, well, it's just always been that way. It's like, could we change? It's like, oh yeah. And so again, enlightened management, great people analytics, good data, they've changed the shift pattern, they're hitting their production targets. And so that's not trying to fix everything everywhere. That's like a very, very discrete, targeted intervention that brings women to work, which is part of what we're all about, and resolves an issue for the business. So we say use the data to guide your activity because it's too big an issue to bite in one gulp.
One of the things that I think employees are incredibly attuned to is the disconnect between words and action. And that's something that, Nabila touched upon is you need to have leaders that model it from the top. A more concrete example is when we first started working from home during the pandemic, you start to get the sense that people's work days got longer. And so leaders said, hey, make sure you log off at, a reasonable time. And then right after, they'll call you at 8 p.m. And so that's a disconnect. And so people are attuned to the fact that the words only carry so much weight. The actual behavior I see is that, you're actually getting me to work later. That's a lack of work-life balance. That might touch upon the psychological contract that we talked about. And so one of the things that I think is really important for employers to do is to listen and get a real picture of why they are seeing a shift. So, often I've heard focus groups, engagement surveys, every company will do them on an annual basis. Once you do those focus groups, once you have that data, assuming all of it is a good process and it's good data, you have to actually act on it. If not, employees are going to know that that's just an annual exercise for the company. And if you're not going to act on this gold mine of information that you have, then that's a waste of financial and time resources anyways. But really listening and understanding, what are those drivers, that's going to help you, understand, predict, try and get ahead of what you're seeing, regardless of the problem. It could apply outside of the Great Resignation.
We're running out of time. So I'm going to flip it. And as we close off, each person has about a minute. What takeaway should I take from this? It's been a fascinating discussion, but as an individual concerned with my own career. So moving from the organization, let's flip it to the individual. And Nabila, you want to start? And what takeaway is the main takeaway from this?
Yeah, I think the main for the individual, I would say it's, this is an employee market. It is, there's a lot of opportunity. But in this great reassessment, I think really make sure that you have a clear definition of what is success for you, and not success just professionally, but what does success in your well-being look like? What does social success look like? What is the success of the family dynamic that you want to have and maintain? What does that success look like in terms of the things that give you joy and meaning in your life? And if you define what does emotional and mental and spiritual success look like for you, and if you just expand that definition of success and you take a minute to reflect on how that your ambition for professional success is defined against all, success in all those different dimensions. And you use that as a personal guide for making the choices that you're going to have to make in the future, to evaluate the options that you're going to be presented, so that you make a choice that meets not just your ambitions professionally, but meets your ambitions more holistically. And if you take that measured approach and you kind of widen your view of what success is, you're going to make the best decision possible for what kind of life you want to live and how you redefine your relationship with work. And I think if we all do that, we'll have a better normal for the future to look forward to.
Ian, a quick takeaway for me as an individual.
Yeah, for you as an individual, I got two, which I think aligns to and builds on what Nabila has been saying. Is like, first of all, understand the career you want and how to keep yourself employable. This is a different labor market. And so there's less, whilst employers may create opportunities for you to grow, owning your own career, owning how you're going to stay employable, owning how you're going to build the career you want. With power comes accountability. So you start to be much more accountable for your own career if you're going to play in the space. And also learn to be skillful at asking for what you need in that employer relationship in an appropriate way. Like, just demanding it as an entitlement is not going to get you where you want to get to. So understand this is a negotiation. There are two sides. There's an appropriate way to ask. There's ways to ask that won't get you where you want to get to. And so getting skillful at that, I think, is a really key piece, so that you're managing your relationship with your employer in a very active and mature way.
Navio, it's hard to follow two wonderful presentations like that, but anything you would add?
I agree that most important is really getting a sense of what is important to you. And if truly the organization you're working at right now is not meeting those needs, this is the perfect buyer's market opportunity for you to find something else and go there instead. However, if when you take that honest, authentic deep dive, and it isn't actually a real underlying, deep and meaningful reason, or your needs are truly met, then I'd say stick with your employer. The pendulum will swing where we're going to have this sort of, less high volatility in the turnover. And so there's also, it's incumbent on the employee to be loyal to their organizations if they are meeting your needs right now as well, and not to just be persuaded by the shiny new work if it doesn't really underline with your underlying values.
Thank you. Fascinating panel, a fascinating talk. I think the first time people have met each other, and hopefully the audience has learned from it. So I thank you on behalf of the organizers for taking part.
You're
Thank
welcome,
you.
Harvey. Thank you.
Thank you.